So here's the typical story people share about identity. You're born, you develop a personality, you make choices that reveal who you are, and through all of this you keep being the same you. There's this idea of a continuous and coherent identity, some kind of invisible link connecting the kid you were with the adult you turn into. Big thinkers like Descartes, Kant, and Husserl built entire philosophies on this premise. Psychologists run with it, and the legal system hinges on it. Society at large needs to believe that the criminal court today is the same one facing a judge months later. But then, you've got Pessoa, who took a long, hard look at this story and called it BS, not in some poetic or metaphorical way, but literally false. He saw it as a dangerous lie we cling to, only because the truth scares the hell out of us. To expose this truth, he created something called the heteronym system. By inventing and fully living through different characters, he aimed to show that identity isn't something you find, it's something you create. It's more like a performance than an essence, more plural than singular. Take Alberto Caeiro, for example, whom Pessoa referred to as his teacher. Born in Lisbon in 1889, Caeiro mostly lived out in the countryside with only a basic education. He supposedly hardly knew anything about literature or philosophy. His poetry, focusing on just pure sensations, steers clear of interpretations. When Caeiro sees a flower, it's just that, a flower. There's no metaphor, no symbol, nothing deeper, just the raw experience of colour and shape. His most well-known piece, The Keeper of Sheep, offers insights like, to think is to not understand. In Cairo's world, philosophy puts up barriers between our consciousness and reality. What we need is to forget everything that separates us from direct experience. Now let's bring in Ricardo Reis, who Pessoa created as a follower of Caeiro, but pitched him philosophically opposite. Reis was born in Porto in 1887, went to a Jesuit school for medical studies and ended up fleeing to Brazil, thanks to his monarchist beliefs clashing with the newly established Portuguese Republic. He crafted elaborate odes in the style of classical Latin and Greek literature, drawing from Horace and the Stoics. While Caeiro is all about living in the now, Reis fixates on fate, death, and how pointless resistance is. His philosophy boils down to accepting whatever happens calmly, savouring short-lived pleasures with restraint, and not fooling yourself into thinking you can change destiny. Life, for him, is set. Fighting it is useless. The wise learn to stay indifferent to unchangeable things. Then there's Álvaro de Campos, the firecracker of the bunch. Campos was born in Tavira in 1890 and went on to study naval and mechanical engineering in Glasgow. He travelled far and wide, writing intense free verse that drew inspiration from Walt Whitman and Italian futurism. Early on, his work like Triumphal Ode and Maritime Ode is all about this hunger to feel and experience everything at once. It's a mad kind of craving. I want to be drunk on everything, he insists, to feel all emotions in every possible way. But down the line, his writing slips into severe depression and deep existential emptiness, with loneliness from the modern world, other folks, and even himself taking centre stage. With these heteronyms, Pessoa didn't just create variations on a theme, he breathed life into utterly conflicting worldviews within one person. Caeiro dismisses thinking altogether. Reis immerses himself in stoic philosophy. Campos swings wildly between extremes, one basks in nature, another in ancient civilizations, and the last in the buzz of industrial modernity. You have one writing in plain Portuguese with mistakes, another in refined classical styles, and the third in fragmented modernist chaos. They all have separate birth dates, life stories, handwriting, and signatures. And the philosophical consequences of all this? Mind-blowing. Imagine a person who embodies a bunch of different selves so thoroughly that they churn out separate bodies of work. What does that tell us about who we really are? Most folks would say Pessoa was just being himself, trying on different masks to explore ideas. But Pessoa didn't buy into that notion. He was firm that these alternate identities, or heteronyms, weren't just disguises. They were versions of himself he fully embraced. When he was writing as Caeiro, he was Cairo. The Fernando Pessoa identity was no more legitimate or genuine than the rest. Maybe it was the least real, because it tried to pretend like he was one unified person. This idea ties into sensationism, a philosophical concept Pessoa came up with in his 20s. It's kind of like taking ideas from the empirical philosophy, especially from Condillac, and cranking them up a notch. His central idea? Everything starts and ends with what we can sense. Not our thoughts, logic, or deep spiritual stuff, but what we experience directly through our senses. Every idea, belief, or identity comes from what we can feel and sense. Any art or philosophy gets real only when it circles back to these senses. Anything else is just floating in the clouds without a base. But Pessoa took it even further than the usual empiricist approach. For him, sensations weren't just something to take in passively. You could grow and refine them, turning them into art. Each of his fictional characters, or heteronyms, experienced reality through different types of sensations. Caeiro felt things directly, without overthinking them. Reis saw things through a stoic lens, accepting them as they were. Campos cranked these sensations up to a 10, pushing them to the edge of what he could handle. By splitting himself into these various characters, Pessoa showed that there were many ways to experience reality. He wasn't just playing a literary game, he was experimenting with different ways of being conscious, proving that having many selves wasn't chaos but a strategy. Typically people experience the world through one narrow perspective, but Pessoa argued that multiple perspectives could help break free from the idea that our identity is one singular thing. Of course, this raises some issues, starting with the practical ones. If who we are is just a bunch of cobbled together identities, how do we keep it all together to function day to day? Pessoa himself found this tough. He worked as a translator, lived alone, hardly published anything while alive, and passed away at 47 from cirrhosis. His personal life was almost a ghost town. The one time he had a serious relationship, with Ophelia Quiros, it fell apart because he couldn't keep up emotionally. Which of his selves was really in love? Which one would be there tomorrow? While having multiple identities might have been great for his writing, it made regular human relationships incredibly challenging. Then there's the philosophical headache of responsibility. If there's no consistent self, who's to blame when someone messes up? Our legal and moral systems need a stable person to hold accountable, but if someone's identity is always changing, that's a tough call. Pessoa knew this issue was there in his writing, but didn't manage to solve it. His take on human experience might be more accurate than traditional ones, but it doesn't really tell us how to handle ethics or justice. And what about communication? When Pessoa was writing as Caeiro, Reis, or Campos, who was actually speaking? Readers find themselves with the text, unsure of who's really behind it. Critics love to argue about whether the things said by these heteronyms align with Pessoa's own thoughts or contradict them. The answer probably isn't straightforward, more like a yes and no. But this models dialogue. For communication to work, we need to believe that the person we're talking to now is the same person who'll reply later. With heteronyms, that certainty goes out the window. Fourth, let's dive into the big question. Does our consciousness really operate the way some theories suggest? If you check out recent findings in psychology and neuroscience, you'll see that sure, people do shift between mental states and sometimes have conflicting beliefs. But still, there's this ongoing neural activity, a blending of memories and a continuous self-story that keeps our sense of identity pretty steady over time. Now, take multiple personality disorder. These days they call it dissociative identity disorder. It's seen as a problem because that usual integration isn't happening. Pessoa might argue that it's actually the push to force integration that's the real issue, claiming people struggle because they're trying too hard to hang on to a single sense of self. But that idea is still up in the air. Fifth, folks are split on whether Pessoa genuinely believed in his own philosophy, or if he was just being super crafty with his artistic approaches. Some feel he truly embodied multiple personas, that the heteronyms, his different writer identities, were genuine expressions of varied facets of him. Others are convinced it was a calculated act, with Pessoa as the mastermind behind the scenes. There's evidence to back up both sides. For instance, on March 8th, 1914, Pessoa talked about experiencing what he called his triumphal day. This was when a character named Caeiro popped into his mind, fully fleshed out, and he cranked out 30 poems in no time. That leans towards a spontaneous mental occurrence. But Pessoa also penned detailed theoretical works on sensationism and outlined how these heteronyms would interact, implying careful planning. When you dig into Pessoa's ideas about identity, you uncover some unsettling truths about being human, all while watching his philosophy unravel in practice. It's true that who we are is more dynamic and built than we often admit. People are full of contradictions and complexities. The sense of a unified self partly relies on the stories we tell ourselves and the memories we keep. Yet living as if we're entirely made up of separate parts just doesn't work. We crave a sense of continuity for building relationships, owning up to our actions and dealing with time. Total fragmentation would lead to loneliness and chaos. This clash between understanding profound truths and facing their limits is woven throughout everything Pessoa wrote. He had an almost unparalleled grasp on how identities operate, but it also made navigating everyday life tough. His heteronyms were both his ultimate success and his existential bind, demonstrating his theories even as they tore him apart. Part 2. The blend of reality and fiction in the Book of Disquiet. The Book of Disquiet is where Pessoa dives deep into the blend of reality and fiction, the dance between consciousness and dreams, the act of living and the act of imagining. Most of these musings are delivered through his sort of alter ego, Bernardo Soares. This hefty work, made up of loose fragments, was just gathering dust in its trunk until years after Pessoa had passed. It's got over 400 bits and pieces. Some are just a paragraph, others stretch for pages. There's no main plot, there's no structure, and certainly no neat and tidy ending. Just pure philosophical musing about existence. Soares is painted as this assistant bookkeeper working in a Lisbon fabric office. He's a humble guy, living in a modest rented room, spending his days on run-of-the-mill work. Outwardly, his life is pretty vacant. But on the inside, that's where the action is, overflowing with deep thoughts on all facets of being. The big aha moment in the book hits you early on. I was someone else for quite a while, from the start of life and awareness. And now, bam, I've woken up midway across a bridge leaning over the river feeling more real than I ever used to. This bit sums up Pessoa's big idea about reality and fiction. The world we call real, our jobs, relationships and daily routines, is like we're just sleepwalking, caught up in a shared illusion without even knowing it. True reality? That's something you bump into during rare flashes of intense self-awareness, when you suddenly see yourself seeing yourself. But those moments, they can be too much to bear. Soares pens, not knowing who you are means you're living, knowing yourself poorly means you're thinking, but glimpsing yourself as I did just then, that's touching a fragment of your soul's deepest reality. And that light, it's so intense, it burns everything away, even your own sense of self. In a twist on Socrates' famous Know Thyself, Pessoa turns things upside down. For Socrates, self-knowledge was the bedrock of wisdom. Pessoa, on the other hand, sees it as disastrous. The clearer you view yourself, the more you understand there's really nothing there. All you've got is a collection of fleeting feelings and thoughts, momentarily stitched together into this made-up entity we call I. Living daily life requires a certain amount of ignorance. A person who sees totally into their own being, they'd be incapacitated by it. Pessoa also had strong thoughts on how literature relates to life. Many people think of literature as coming after life. It's either a mirror or a shadow of our actual reality. First you live your life, and then you write about those experiences. Experience is the original, writing is the copy. Pessoa turned that on its head. For him, writing is more authentic than living. Suarez puts it plainly. To write is to forget. Literature is the most pleasant way of ignoring life. This isn't about escaping. Pessoa's getting at something bolder. Ordinary living? It's unconscious, on autopilot, unexamined. Writing snaps you into awareness. It makes life's details come into full focus. When you write, you capture the reality you didn't even see while you were living it. The Book of Disquiet's fragmented form showcases this philosophy perfectly. A standard story has a beginning, middle, end. It's about continuity and development. But Pessoa, he saw human experience as choppy and inconsistent. Every moment stands alone, disconnected from what came before or what's up next. Memory tricks us, weaving a narrative to give disconnected events a false sense of flow. The disjointed nature of disquiet fights back against this misleading coherence. Each snippet can stand independently. There's no building up, no conclusion, just one sharp moment of awareness following another. Take this line, for instance. I'm always taken aback when I finish anything, surprised and honestly a bit bummed out. My obsession with getting things perfect should make it impossible for me to ever finish anything. I shouldn't even be able to start. This shows Pessoa's take on taking action. Doing anything means you have to believe it matters, think the results are significant, and have faith that your current efforts will pay off later. But if life is just a made-up story, and who we are is always changing, then how can you justify doing anything? Why would one part of you make the effort for a different part of you that will exist tomorrow? Trying to be perfect is pointless because there's no constant you to achieve it. This leads to what people call Pessoa's paralysis problem. His thoughts capture experience accurately, but make dealing with the world hopeless. Suarez mostly lives in his own mind. Things happening outside barely make a difference. I always live in the now, he says. I know nothing about the future, and the past is gone. The future drags me down with endless possibilities, and the past weighs me down with its emptiness. Without a past or future, and without believing in continuity or results, all that's left is a pure awareness of the present. This is intriguing for philosophy, but terrible for real life. The Book of Disquiet goes into what might be called Pessoa's view of everyday existence. While philosophers from Husserl to Heidegger might tackle big questions about consciousness, Pessoa looked at the small details of ordinary life. Suarez gives us a vivid picture of the afternoon light in Lisbon, the dullness of office work, watching strangers at cafes, and the emptiness of Sunday afternoons. These detailed observations turn normal life into something strange and meaningful. I feel like I'm always almost waking up, says Suarez. I'm always sleepy, with a sleep that isn't mine, like the soul inside me is dreaming me. This hints at the idea that being awake is like dreaming itself. We think we're awake, aware and making choices, but we're really just going through the motions without realizing it. Being truly awake would mean seeing past this dream and understanding everything we think is real isn't. But we'd never fully wake up because the nature of our consciousness needs some level of self-deception to function. Pessoa also offers a deep look into how imagination relates to reality. Most people think imagination is secondary, creating unreal images compared to perception, which brings real ones. Pessoa flipped that idea. Imagination is more real than perception because it's more conscious. When you perceive, your mind just takes in sensory data. When you imagine, you actively create the experience. Imagined experiences are more real because they are more intentional and conscious. This idea changes everything. If what's imagined is more real than what's lived, then books not written are more real than those that are. Lives not lived are more real than the ones we live. What's possible is more real than what's actual. Suarez writes, I've dreamed more than Napoleon accomplished. I've hugged more humanity in thought than Christ held in reality. I can see philosophies that no one ever wrote down. These aren't just grandiose dreams. They're statements on how imagination ranks in reality. What exists in consciousness has a greater reality than what exists unconsciously in the outside world. But this brings up clear issues. First, there's the problem of knowing what's real. If imagined experiences are more real than actual ones, how do we tell truth from fantasy? Pessoa might say, drawing that line is pointless because all experience is, in a way, fantasy. The real question isn't about what experiences are real or imagined, but rather about which fantasies we're aware of and which ones we're not. But if you look at it this way, you're left without an external benchmark for truth. Everything feels subjective, something internal that can't really be proven. This makes philosophy pretty much impossible, because it depends on having a common reality to talk about. Then there's the issue of solipsism. If your imagined world inside your head feels more real than the world outside, why bother interacting with other people at all? After all, other people might just be figments of your imagination. Someone standing right in front of you feels less real than the idea you have of them. This kind of thinking leads to a lot of loneliness. Just take Pessoa as an example. He didn't have many close friends, kept away from deep emotional connections, and spent most of his time writing alone. The very philosophy that fueled his art also made it really hard for him to live a normal life. Next up is the question of value. If dreaming about an achievement feels more worthwhile than actually doing something, what's the point of doing anything at all? Why bother writing a book when just thinking about it feels more real? Why strive to achieve things in the real world when just imagining it suffices? Pessoa dealt with this dilemma his whole life. He left behind loads of unfinished bits and pieces, and he rarely completed his projects. His philosophical outlook justified these incomplete works by placing more importance on imagined success rather than real-world outcomes. Essentially, his view was counterproductive, making it hard for him to even articulate it fully. Scholars also argue over whether Pessoa genuinely believed in the supremacy of imagination, or if he was just making excuses for his own setbacks. During his lifetime he published next to nothing, earned little recognition from the outside world, and lived largely in the shadows. Conveniently, his philosophy spins it so that obscurity is better than fame, incomplete work better than finished projects, and inner life more important than outer achievements. Critics say this isn't real philosophy, but rather a clever way of justifying himself. Pessoa would probably say that these critics are missing the point, because they're clinging to values he dismissed, but people still have their doubts. Another tricky bit is how Pessoa's Book of Disquiet deals with authenticity. With a character like Suarez, who is only partly fictional, how much of what he says really reflected what Pessoa believed, and how much was just the character talking? Pessoa describes Suarez as himself stripped of any rationality and emotion, a mutilated version of himself, in his words. So do the parts of Suarez that remain still represent Pessoa, or maybe even the real Pessoa is just another made-up character. The book never gives a straight answer because that would require a fixed authorial identity, something Pessoa didn't believe in. The philosophical beauty of the Book of Disquiet lies in showing that reality isn't as solid as we think, that fiction and fact are always mingling, that consciousness and dreams are side by side. The strongest experiences happen not through action, but imagination. Most people just go through life on the autopilot and never wake up. These ideas are philosophically rich, even if they lead to a pretty unsettling life. But the book also hits on the limits of extreme subjectivism. Sure, a lot of our reality is shaped by our minds. And yes, imagination plays a big role in how we experience life. And it's true that the self isn't as coherent as philosophers traditionally thought. But if you toss away any notion of external reality entirely, or prize imagination above real-life actions and scatter your identity to the wind, you end up in a pretty unlivable place. Pessoa himself showed this through his way of life. While his philosophy had some incredible truth to it, it also led to a life of isolation, paralysis, and eventually downfall. The challenge is figuring out whether you can take these insights without falling into their traps, if it's possible to see beyond the illusion while still interacting with the world. Pessoa never did find that middle ground. Maybe it doesn't exist at all. Part 3. Pessoa, a literary genius of the 20th century, presented a groundbreaking view of consciousness. His ideas not only echoed phenomenology's breakthroughs, but also went beyond them, all through his storytelling rather than academic discourse. His main point? Our consciousness isn't a single seamless stream, but a jumble of viewpoints. It's not a steady observer, but rather a kaleidoscope of ever-changing perspectives. And when it comes to knowing ourselves, it's more of a trick than true insight. Let's talk about self-knowledge, starting with Socrates. He believed that knowing yourself was both possible and worthwhile. You dig into your beliefs, your desires, and your character. You mull over your experiences and what drives you. By seriously contemplating these things, you land on a clear picture of who you are. Later on, thinkers from the Enlightenment took this further, suggesting that people have a special kind of access to their own minds. For Descartes, this was a rock-solid foundation. I think, therefore I am. Even if I doubt everything else, I can't doubt that I exist because I'm doubting. Self-awareness was for him the cornerstone of knowing anything. Then comes Pessoa, throwing a wrench in the whole idea. He argued that the self we think knows itself is a made-up story. There's no stable self to pin down. Instead, consciousness is more like a series of brief random gatherings that continuously form and dissolve. What we call the self is just a story we tell ourselves afterward, to make sense of an otherwise chaotic existence. To quote from one of his alter egos, Suarez, I realize I was just a string of mistakes and detours, that I've never truly lived, existing only as a series of conscious moments and thoughts. When you really look at it, the concrete self falls apart, leaving nothing but layers of thoughts about thoughts, consciousness peering at consciousness. This ties into what scholars talk about as Pessoa's way of exploring these ideas, though he didn't label it as phenomenology. Husserl, a major figure in phenomenology, tried to describe how consciousness appears to us, putting aside questions about the world outside in order to hone in on how we actually experience things. Pessoa was right there, but even more daring. While Husserl sought universal traits common to all consciousness, Pessoa saw only a mess of differences. Husserl proposed an organizing ego at the heart of experience, whereas Pessoa found nothing. Just an empty space where an ego might have been. Take for instance when Pessoa describes suddenly seeing himself clearly. I'm hit by this sarcastic fear of life, a sadness too big to fit into my conscious mind. I see that I've been all wrong, that I haven't lived, merely wasted time by thinking and staying conscious. This newfound understanding of my real self, that one forever sleepwalking between emotions and observations, lands on me like an ominous sentence to carry out. This moment captures Pessoa's biggest insight about consciousness. It fundamentally dodges seeing itself for what it is. Most of the time, being conscious is similar to being in a state of half-awareness, going through life on autopilot. Truly understanding yourself is both rare and unnerving. When consciousness really examines itself, it sees there's nothing solid behind the scenes, only endless change and transition. What we call the unity of consciousness is just a convenient fairy tale designed to keep us going. Interestingly, this aligns with the Buddhist idea of no self, though Pessoa came to it from a Western mindset and personal experiences. In Buddhism, the self is seen as an illusion fostered by clinging and ignorance. Freedom comes from seeing past this illusion, to recognize the impersonal forces shaping our experiences. Pessoa ended up in a similar place but took a different route. While Buddhism suggests meditation to dissolve this self-illusion and find peace, Pessoa embraced it by creating multiple identities or heteronyms to embrace the chaos and fuel his creativity. Both philosophers acknowledge that the self is like a fictional character, but they have different ideas on how to deal with it. Pessoa came up with what you might call a philosophy of attention. Attention isn't something that just happens. It actively shapes what we notice in our minds. Most of us don't pay much attention. We just react to things as they happen, almost as if we're on autopilot. Waking up to real consciousness requires us to be aware of our own awareness, to step back and observe ourselves thinking and watching. This kind of awareness is tiring and hard to keep up, but it's the only state where we truly understand our own consciousness. Pessoa's different personas, or heteronyms, each represent unique ways of paying attention. One of them, Caeiro, focuses on pure sense perception, free from any mental chatter or labels. He aims to see the world with the innocence of a child, before language and societal norms complicate things. Caeiro believes mystery isn't about questioning the unknown, but rather in simply experiencing it directly. For him, consciousness becomes clear when it stops getting in the way of perception, when thought disappears and only pure seeing remains. Reis, on the other hand, practices a kind of attention that comes with stoic acceptance. He notices everything around him, but remains emotionally detached, viewing pleasure and pain with the same indifferent gaze. This detachment comes with an understanding of life's transience and the inevitability of death, which brings about a calm and resigned outlook that expects nothing. Reis advises people to observe life from afar and not question it too much, since there's nothing much to gain from it. His consciousness achieves wisdom by retreating from engagement, maintaining inner peace by avoiding disturbances. Campos takes yet another approach, opting for a kind of attention that's all about experiencing everything intensely. He tries to feel all there is to feel, all at once, which leads to these bursts of manic energy that inevitably collapse into depression. In his early work, he boldly states he wants to be everyone and experience everything, but constantly stretching consciousness to its limits leaves it shattered and drained. Later, he writes that he feels like nothing, that he'll never amount to anything, except for harbouring all the world's dreams. This shows how maximum intensity can end in a sense of loss. These three approaches show different ways consciousness can engage with experiences: directly without thought, calmly with acceptance, or intensely grasping at all possibilities. Each has its perks and downsides, revealing different truths about what it means to be conscious. Pessoa's genius was in recognizing that no single way of paying attention successfully captures the whole of conscious experience. You need different perspectives, different selves, different ways to be aware. However, this brings up another problem. What holds these various aspects together? If consciousness is diverse, how do these different ways of paying attention sync up? When Pessoa switches between characters like Caeiro, Reis, and Campos, something triggers which persona takes the lead. But what's doing this switching? If there's no one unified self, who or what is pulling the strings? Pessoa didn't answer this question. He brilliantly portrayed the idea of a multifaceted self, but he couldn't quite explain how this multiplicity organizes itself, even for a short while. Scholars have linked Pessoa's ideas to several philosophical traditions. Nietzsche, for instance, also questioned the idea of a unified self, stating that rather than I think, it should be it thinks, making consciousness feel more like an impersonal process. Both Nietzsche and Pessoa rejected the traditional idea of a singular rational self, emphasizing creative will over logic and deliberation. Both Nietzsche and Pessoa used more literary and philosophical styles rather than detailed patterns of reasoning. However, Nietzsche focused on the idea of self-improvement, moulding yourself through dedicated effort. On the other hand, Pessoa didn't really push for such a mission. His heteronyms just exist side by side, each one whole and complete by itself. Take a look at how this was compared to William James' view of psychology. James described consciousness like a stream, always moving, never the same from one moment to the next. He didn't buy into the idea of a deeper self behind our experiences, and instead saw the self as simply the latest thought melding with past ones. Pessoa was on board with this, but took it even further. While James assumed each person had a single stream of consciousness, Pessoa showed us multiple streams, with distinct consciousnesses at play within just one person. This idea either pushes James's theories further, or maybe it's just blurring the lines between literary styles and psychological truths. There are some experts who link Pessoa's work to modern consciousness studies and cognitive science. There's this idea called the modular mind hypothesis, which suggests our thinking is made up of a bunch of seemingly independent systems, rather than one unified brain. Different parts process things like perception, language, memory, and social interactions. Sometimes these systems clash, which might explain why we sometimes feel internal disagreement or confusion. Pessoa's heteronyms might be over-the-top, literary versions of actual cognitive processes, exaggerated a bit for artistic effect, but grounded in real mental functionalities. Or maybe they're entirely made up, with no ties to real mental workings. The real-world evidence doesn't lean strongly one way or the other. A big issue with Pessoa's take on consciousness is it makes decision-making just about impossible. If our consciousness is really fragmented with no solid self pulling the strings, how do we make choices? Every decision requires some level of belief that the person deciding is the same person who deals with the outcomes. But if your identity isn't steady, then decisions become random. Why would today's you make sacrifices for tomorrow's you? Pessoa lived this conundrum himself. He famously had a hard time making decisions, often struggling to finish tasks or stick with plans. He understood why choices are philosophically tricky, but didn't offer any practical solutions. Another problem is, his perspective makes communication a mess. Talking assumes the person speaking has something specific they mean, which the listener can understand. But if there's no steady speaker, just ever-changing viewpoints and bits of selves, communication is more of a happy accident than an intentional achievement. You might think you're sharing Cairo's thoughts, but then Reis enters the frame, Campos misses the point, and Pessoa himself can't really step in to clear things up. The material ends up meaning whatever the current reader and writer managed to put together. It's an imaginative process, but all over the place. It wipes out the possibility of any stable meaning. The biggest paradox in Pessoa's philosophy is he says there's no single self, but at the same time, someone had to organise all those heteronyms, craft their backstories, assign them their poems, and keep everything running over time. Doing all of that would need just the kind of unity he argued against. You could claim the heteronyms just appeared out of nowhere, that Pessoa was truly manifold, but even that would need some kind of biological platform to keep everything together, allowing these personalities to pop up. His philosophy fails to explain how it even exists in the first place. Still, even with these bumps, Pessoa's unique take on consciousness offers a lot to think about. Through his consistent literary work, he showed us that consciousness is way more complex and diverse than traditional thinkers admitted. Understanding yourself isn't just about seeing an inner truth clearly. It's more like an ongoing loop, where observing actually creates what you see. We don't usually give enough credit to how much attention shapes what we experience. Instead of being one straightforward self, we're more like a team of different voices and views loosely held together by the stories we tell ourselves. These ideas stick around, even if some of the extreme ideas don't pan out. The real challenge is whether we can embrace the idea that consciousness is made up of many parts without jumping to the conclusion that there's no self whatsoever. Can we see how identity is built without ditching the idea that there's a continuous thread running through it all? Can we realize that our inner experiences are diverse, but avoid getting stuck in indecision? Pessoa really took a deep dive into exploring consciousness and found that being super conscious just doesn't hold up. Maybe the key is having a balanced level of awareness, knowing some things about ourselves but not being completely see-through. It seems that full-on self-awareness might not be doable, not because we can't, but because being fully aware of ourselves might stop us from being us altogether. Part 4. Sensationism is what Pessoa aimed for as he tried to lay down a solid philosophical base for modernist art. At the start of the 1910s, he teamed up with his buddy, Mário de Sacarneiro, to craft this fresh aesthetic idea. They put sensation before thought, diversity over unity, and the act of creating art above, simply expressing it naturally. Although Pessoa penned manifestos and essays about it, you really grasp sensationism by looking at what the heteronyms do. It's straightforward. All art kicks off and wraps up with sensation, not with ideas or emotions, not with moral lessons or political statements, but with raw sensory experiences. Art shouldn't just show reality or share feelings. It's there to spark a sensory reaction in whoever is experiencing it. Traditional views held that art mimics nature or unveils some truth. The Romantic outlook said art should showcase the artist's true feelings. Sensationism tossed both ideas aside. Art isn't meant to mimic or express. It's about being a masterpiece of sensations. This didn't come out of nowhere, though. It builds on and even shakes up past empiricist ideas. Philosophers like Locke and Hume claimed everything we know starts with our senses. Abstract ideas are really just a mix of basic sensory bits, and the mind doesn't have any inborn content, just a knack for sorting out the sensory stuff we take in. Pessoa went along with this, but he took it deeper into the realm of art. If all knowledge stems from sensation and art is a form of knowledge too, then art should dive into sensory depth and breadth. The ultimate art hits you with loads of different sensations. Pessoa broke this down into 3 parts: sensation, suggestion, and construction. Sensation is the immediate impact, the straight-up effect the piece has on your senses. This could be through sight, sound, touch, or even the mix of those senses that modernist art plays with. Suggestion goes further, conjuring up feelings that aren't right there in front of you. It's like starting a chain of associations that boost that initial sensory effect. Construction comes from the carefully crafted layout, ensuring both the direct sensory and suggested experiences are just right. It's not random expression, but more like a well thought out blueprint. Look at how the heteronyms illustrate these ideas. Caeiro is all about the direct hit, just sensation. His poetry lays out perception in its raw form, without any mixing in of personal take. The Tagus is more beautiful than the river running through my village. But the Tagus is not more beautiful than the river running through my village, because the Tagus is not the river running through my village. No symbols, no big ideas, just the pure form of each experience as they are, hard to compare or box into. Categories. It's sensation on its own. No suggestion, no artifice. Reus, in contrast, lay a suggestion through classic references and myths. His verses weave a dense web of connections to the cultures of Greece and Rome, making even a little look feel enormous by association. Rivers bring to mind Lethe, roses whisper tempus fugit, gods make you think of entire mythologies. Suggestion increases the sensory impact massively, yet Reus also leans on construction. His verses play by the rules, full of classical metre, elaborate stanza patterns and crafty rhetorical turns. Every syllable is placed with intention. That smooth natural vibe is actually built from the ground up. Then there's Campos, who cranks up everything to the extreme. His initial odes overwhelm with sensory fireworks, machine sounds, big city scenes, throngs of people, wild speed, gear and chaos. It's like sensations piled up too close to separate. The suggestions fly just as high, with nods to tech, empire, modern life, and disintegration weaving through his words. The whole setup might look like pandemonium, but it's artistry in pure, unfiltered action. Okay, so here's the deal. You know how some poetry might look all random and free-flowing, like it's just someone jotting down whatever pops into their head? Well, that's not exactly what's going on. It's more like controlled chaos, with patterns that speed up and slow down to guide you through it. Now there's this idea called sensationism, which flips the traditional script on its head. In the old days, art was all about being genuine, showing real feelings. But sensationism? Nah, it's a whole different ballgame. It's about getting rid of the artist's personal touch entirely. The artist should vanish behind the art, acting as a channel for pure sensation. That's where Pessoa, a key figure in this movement, steps in with his heteronyms. Basically, imaginary characters through whom he works his magic. This trick lets him fully detach, so it's not about his personal emotions at all. The artwork stands alone, with no need to dig into the creator's life for meaning. This mirrors some bigger shifts in modernist art. T.S. Eliot, around the same time, was also singing this tune with his impersonality theory. He was all about poetry, being an escape from emotion, not an outpouring of it. Ezra Pound threw his hat in the ring with imagism, which was about cutting out fluff and getting down to the real essence of things. And futurism? They were buzzing about the sensory overload of machines and fast-paced world. Pessoa's deal, though, is a bit different from the rest. Eliot thought poets should stick to a single tradition, but Pessoa? No way. He's all for mixing things up, tossing traditions around like a salad. While Pound seeks the one perfect word, Pessoa's sensationism says there isn't just one view, just a bunch of different feelings. And where futurism might celebrate just one type of experience, the industrial one, Pessoa is saying, hey, sensation is so diverse, every sense has its own reality. This changes how we see art in a big way. If art is just about building sensations, then all the old ways of judging it don't make sense anymore. You can't look at sincerity or realism. It's more about whether the artwork hits you with intense and varied sensations. This opens doors wide for the wild creativity, but leaves us without clear ways to gauge what's good or not. Pessoa also had thoughts on mixing art forms. Old school thinking kept painting, poetry and music in their separate corners. But sensationism says they're all just ways to create sensations. This kind of thinking leads to blends, like trying to make poetry sound like music, or painting with words. That's what his heteronyms are all about. Different lenses for seeing the world. Of course, sensationism isn't without its faults. For one, if any art that creates sensation is valid, how do you sift out the great from the not so great? Pessoa didn't really answer that. He'd probably shrug it off, saying good and bad don't really fit anymore. But if that's true, how do we critique art? It leaves us just noting sensations without measuring them. And then there's the catch with communication. If art's all just about the sensations it sparks, how do we even talk about what makes one piece of art more impactful than another? These kinds of questions show that this idea isn't tied up with a neat little bow. But isn't that part of what makes it so intriguing? So here's the deal. If art is all about just creating sensations without trying to express anything on purpose, how do artists and viewers actually connect? Old school art theories figured art was about passing on some sort of meaning or feeling from the artist to the audience. But sensationism says otherwise. So if there's no message being passed, why bother with art at all? Pessoa might argue that it's the sensation itself that gets shared. But here's the catch. Everyone experiences these sensations differently. The way you feel looking at a piece of art isn't going to be the same as the next person's. So what exactly are we sharing then? Moving on to meaning. If sensationism throws away the idea of art having any meaning and just treats it as a way to stimulate our senses, then how do we make sense of Pessoa's poetry, which is loaded with meaning? His different personas, or heteronyms, make deep philosophical statements, paint worldviews and share opinions. How does this align with just pure sensation? Pessoa might argue that those meanings are sensations too, that even ideas are a type of mental sensation. But if we call everything a sensation, then the word loses meaning and doesn't explain much anymore. Next up, originality. Sensationism claims to be this groundbreaking aesthetic, but is it really all that new? Back in the late 1800s, folks like Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater were already focusing more on sensation rather than meaning. Wilde even said that all art is quite useless, implying it doesn't need justification beyond being pleasing to the senses. So what makes sensationism stand out? Pessoa might point to how it's systematically laid out, rooted deeply in empirical philosophy, and expanded via his heteronyms. But critics might just see it as an extension rather than a revolution. Then there's the debate about whether Pessoa's poetry even succeeds in living up to sensationist ideals. Take Caeiro. one of his personas. His poems claim to be pure sensations without thought, but they're written in language, and language is full of concepts. You can't escape words using words. Even just describing a sensation is already a type of interpretation. So saying you can have pure perception is itself an idea about perception, which contradicts itself. The same goes for another persona, Reis. His poems trigger classical references, but references are thoughts, not raw sensations. Campos, another persona, throws you into a whirlwind of imagery, but he still uses words to make sense of that chaos. The language of poetry is deeply tied to concepts, making it impossible to achieve the theory's ideals fully in practice. Now, on the psychological front, do we ever actually experience pure sensation? Modern cognitive science suggests otherwise. Our perception is always part of the interpretation. They happen together. The brain doesn't get raw data and then think about it. It all happens at once, with conception tightly woven into perceiving. You can't separate sensation from the mind's categorization. Pessoa's whole approach relies on a view of the mind that psychology doesn't back up. Pure sensation? It just doesn't exist. Even with all these issues, sensationism still brought some cool ideas into art theory. It put sensation back in the spotlight in understanding art experiences, which had often been overshadowed by meaning and emotion. It pushed the idea that artworks build their own reality, paving the way for constructivist views in aesthetics. It embraced diversity over sticking to one thing, allowing more room for fragmented and contradictory art. It also showed how a single artist could rock different styles by playing with different sensory angles. These takeaways still hold value, even if the grand theory itself doesn't fully hold up. In practice, sensationism had a big impact on how Pessoa made his poetry. Whatever the theoretical hiccups, the use of sensationism helped Pessoa's heteronyms to create remarkable pieces. Caeiro's poems, for example, stand out with clarity and freshness just by cutting away excess conceptual baggage. Reis's traditional accuracy offers thought-provoking reflections on time and the inevitability of death. Meanwhile, Campos's vibrant energy brings to life the intensity and psychological toll of modern living. Even though the aesthetic theory made an impact artistically, it didn't quite hold up philosophically. This shows that sending out philosophically confusing vibes might actually inspire amazing art. The debate is whether sensationism sheds light on art in general, or if it's just about what makes Pessoa's work tick. Is it uncovering universal truths, or is it just a deep dive into one unique situation? Pessoa was convinced he'd uncovered some deep truths about the artistic experience, but many experts think he was simply outlining his own way of working and saw it as a rule book for everyone. The variety of personalities in his work resonated with him due to his unique mindset, not because they represented essentials for artistic creation. Other creatives find success using totally distinct approaches. Honest sharing works wonders for confessional poets, while unity is the magic ingredient for traditional artists, and pure expression fits romantics like a glove. Sensationism is one of countless paths, great for some, but definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution. The core of the issue might be that sensationism, similar to all of Pessoa's philosophical ideas, stretches good insight so far that they eventually snap. It's true that sensation is vital in art, yet so are meaning, feelings, form, tradition and innovation. Sure, stepping back from personal input can spark creativity, but so can staying true to oneself. Exploring many possibilities is enriching, yet so is sticking to a singular vision. While sensationism highlights key truths about how we experience art, it overextends them into a theory that doesn't quite fit art's actual variety. Its true value lies in the bits of insight, not the entire package. Part 5. Political Philosophy in the Fifth Empire. Pessoa's political ideas are a real mixed bag. They combine some pretty contradictory stuff, like reactionary nationalism right alongside anarchist individualism, prophetic visions tossed in with a good dose of realism, and mystical beliefs mixed with down-to-earth policy ideas. The core of all this is the Fifth Empire, a mystical idea that Portugal has a future where it leads the world culturally and spiritually. To grasp this, we need to dive into the political scene of early 1900s Portugal and the mystical traditions Pessoa leaned on. During Pessoa's time, Portugal was all over the place politically. The monarchy got the boot in 1910, making way for a republic that swung wildly between different factions. This period, known as the First Republic, was marked by political mayhem, assassinations and military coups. Pessoa looked at this chaos and saw nothing but disdain. He was no fan of republican democracy, thinking it just gave power to the clueless. Socialism and communism were big no-nos for him too, as he thought they threatened personal freedom. For a short while, he even backed the military dictatorship of Sidónio Pais, going so far as to pen a poem that praised Pais as a kind of mythic hero. However, after Pais was killed in 1918, Pessoa grew more and more gloomy about where Portugal was headed politically. The idea of the Fifth Empire sprang up as an antidote to the mess he saw around him, pulling from the predictions of 16th century Portuguese mystics like Goncalo Arnas Bandara and 17th century Jesuit thinker Antonio Vieira. Pessoa dreamed of Portugal leading the world into a new cultural and spiritual era. But this wasn't about military might or economic strength. Portugal had long lost those. Instead, it would be through language, cultural influence, and spiritual insights. According to Pessoa, the Portuguese language would become the language of the future, carrying Portuguese spiritual values across the globe. This dream built on a Portuguese tradition called Sebastianism. It started when King Sebastian vanished during a battle in 1578, spawning legends that he'd come back to restore Portugal's grandeur. This belief wasn't just for the elites. It stuck around for centuries, especially with the everyday folk. Vieira took this idea further, saying the Fifth Empire, as foretold in the biblical book of Daniel, would be Portuguese, coming after the Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires. Pessoa took this concept and tweaked it, transforming the Fifth Empire from a territorial to a spiritual and cultural one. In Pessoa's thinking, history moved through 5 empires, each adding an important piece. Greece brought knowledge and philosophy to the table. Rome spread that culture and added laws. Christianity mixed Western and Eastern wisdom into this blend, and then Europe, led by the British Empire, carried the synthesis worldwide through individualism and trade. The Fifth Empire would be the finishing touch, marrying material and spiritual insights, combining reason with mysticism, and bringing together wisdom from both Western and Eastern traditions. Portugal, with its deep ties to ancient spiritual ways and openness to modern ideas, was destined to lead this charge. His lone book published while he was alive, Message, lays out this grand vision in 44 short poems that celebrate Portuguese history and prophecy. It's split into 3 parts, charting Portugal's path from legendary beginnings through a period of historical greatness to eventual fulfillment. The final section, The Hidden One, specifically references the Fifth Empire, casting King Sebastian as a messianic figure who'll kickstart this new era. The Hidden One also taps into esoteric traditions, hinting at secret knowledge guarded by a select few that'll be unveiled when the moment is right. And Pessoa took all this quite seriously. He was big into astrology, making birth charts to try and predict Portugal's fate. He looked into Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, Freemasonry, and a bunch of other secretive traditions, convinced they held the mystical wisdom needed for the Fifth Empire to come about. So he spent a lot of time putting together these detailed theories about how Portugal's cultural approach should gear up for the future. In his mind, his own writings, especially the ones under his various pen names, were a step towards what he called the Fifth Empire, a vision showcasing Portugal's cultural finesse and philosophical depth. However, this is where his way of thinking gets pretty dicey. His sense of national pride often blurred into prejudiced attitudes. He had some pretty negative things to say about Africans, Asians, and even other Europeans. He kind of saw Portuguese culture as top tier, like it was meant to lead spiritually, either by God's will or because of the turns of history. He had a soft spot for authoritarian regimes, thinking democracy was too bland and that dictatorships could potentially lift up the standouts. He was a fan of some fascist ideas, particularly around economic systems and moving away from parliamentary setups. Forget about universal voting rights. He believed most folks weren't cut out for decision-making. There's some debate among scholars about whether we should really take his ideas to heart. Some see him as a guy whose authoritarian leanings provide dangerous justifications. Others think his views were messier, pointing out he wasn't exactly a fan of Salazar's rule, despite warming up to the idea of dictatorship earlier. His big focus on the individual didn't jibe with totalitarian practices, and his mystical leanings seemed more personal than political. The bottom line is, Pessoa's political views were a bit all over the place, lacking any real unified philosophy. On one side, he pushed for radical individualism. He argued for minimal state intervention, maximal freedom, and not identifying with anything beyond maybe some voluntary connections. He seriously echoed some anarchist vibes, basically siding with the idea that minimal government is the best government. He had no love for groupthink, mass movements, or the idea of individuals playing second fiddle to the collective. He glorified the lone thinker who seeks truth, never mind what society thinks. So in some ways his thoughts were rather libertarian, pushing back against any version of collectivism. Then, on the flip, you had his authoritarian nationalism. He backed the idea of standout people steering the ship for those less in the know. Hierarchy, tradition, and good old-fashioned order, those were his jams, pushing back against the idea of democracy evening the playing field too much. He was big on Portugal's supposed cultural superiority and its destined historical role. He thought those with prophetic vision should call the shots, not the whims of the masses. His idea was to get Portugal back on top, through cultural and spiritual power plays. This was definitely a reactionary and elitist way of thinking, skating close to fascist ideals. But these ideas never really gelled together in a tidy package. It's like he longed for an anarchist world that catered to exceptional folks like him, but wanted authoritarian reins on everyone else. He envisioned freedom for the intellectual elite and structure for the ordinary people. He hoped for Portugal to rule on a cultural front, while individuals there did their own thing. Politically speaking, it didn't add up, but it says a lot about him psychologically. Felt superior, wanted his talent appreciated, but craved solitude and shunned social ties. This whole concept of the Fifth Empire hits some critical snags. First, there's the reality check. No signs pointed to Portugal's prominent role in a global spiritual revolution. Back in Pessoa's day, the country was on the decline, with political chaos, economic issues, and fading colonial influence. There was zero indication of a cultural takeover. He knew that, which is why his empire was to be spiritual, not physical. Yet spiritual sway is even trickier to prove. How would you decide if Portugal pulled off the spiritual lead? What would you measure against? Pessoa didn't give any clear criteria, just mystical musings. Then there's the historical side of it. The trends he claimed to see in past empires, those are up for debate. First off, there's this idea floating around that Greece was the be-all and end-all of knowledge, that Rome was just the messenger boy passing Greek culture around, and that Christianity somehow melded all of this together perfectly. Then there's the question of whether Europe just picked up where Christianity left off, or if it grew within it. And is British individualism really Europe's big gift to the world? Well, if you ask historians, they'd likely have a lot to say against those claims. Pessoa's take on history mixes in mythology more than it delivers hard facts. He's basically looking backwards with rose-coloured glasses, trying to set the stage for what he thinks the future should look like. Then there's the whole language thing. Pessoa was convinced Portuguese would be the language of the future. But let's be real. Compared to English, Spanish, Chinese or Arabic, Portuguese is a pretty minor player on the world stage. Plus, Brazil, with more Portuguese speakers than Portugal, was doing its own thing culturally. So unless you buy into the idea that Portuguese holds some mystical power, other languages don't, this claim doesn't really hold water. Linguistics would call this idea a stretch at best. Moving on to the messy topic of colonialism. During Pessoa's lifetime, Portugal held on to its colonies in Africa and Asia. His idea of the Fifth Empire leans heavily on Portugal's past as a colonizer, suggesting it could continue to wield cultural influence over places it no longer controlled. But let's not forget, colonialism was rife with exploitation, slavery and violence. Thinking Portugal should lead in some sort of spiritual empire smacks of dated beliefs in European superiority. Naturally, post-colonial critics aren't too happy about this, calling it imperialist ideas wrapped in fancy words. Then there's this tricky issue regarding fascism. Pessoa's relationship with fascism gets a bit murky. The Fifth Empire talk does sound a little fascist, what with its emphasis on national greatness, a supposed historical mission, strong leaders and the idea of one group of people being superior. Pessoa might argue his nationalism was about culture, not race, and about spirituality, not material gain. But really it's more about the bigger picture of his way of thinking. So, are we talking about a real political vision here, or just a literary dreamscape? It's up for debate. Some of his writings suggest he really believed Portugal would rise to spiritual prominence, yet his tone in other writings hints that he knew the difference between myth and reality. Maybe he was living in both worlds, taking the Fifth Empire as both a real forecast and a creative tool. That said, his political views didn't exactly light the world on fire. He didn't start any movements, outline policies that saw the light of day, or leave much of a political mark beyond his literary works. Understanding his politics can help make sense of his thinking and poetry, even if they didn't change the world. They do, however, show how someone so bright in philosophy could still trip up politically, spinning linguistic brilliance into ideological nonsense and letting personal isolation lead to grandiose fantasies. The big question is whether we can separate his philosophical wisdom about identity and consciousness from his dicey political views. Many say yes, arguing that his metaphysical and aesthetic ideas can stand on their own just fine. Others see deeper connections, suggesting that the same tendencies driving his self-explorative thoughts also pop up in his nationalist musings. This debate doesn't seem to be settling down anytime soon, but what's clear is that when it came to applying his philosophical concepts to the political realm, Pessoa didn't quite make the leap. His insights into individual identity and the nature of self don't quite translate on the broader political stage. Countries aren't like individual people. For a community to have a shared identity, it needs a consistent story, but Pessoa's way of thinking pulls that apart. Politics needs dedication, which his doubt disrupts, and a society needs consistency, which his focus on multiple perspectives tears down. When he tried to think about politics, it either turned into confusing contradictions or risky mysticism. As someone who viewed things in fragments, he struggled to envision a solid unified existence for groups. This might hint at where philosophy hits its roadblocks. There are issues that need solutions beyond just one person's viewpoint. Political philosophy has to explain how huge groups of people work together, find common ground, and create systems. But Pessoa's extreme focus on individualism and doubts about a unified identity make it hard to do that. While his philosophy is great for looking at one unique person's mind, it's not much help in figuring out how people live in communities. His take on political thought is where you really see how his ideas fall short in practical terms. Part 6. Getting into the mystical and mysterious stuff with Pessoa. Pessoa was deeply into the mysterious and mystical sides of life, something that's often overlooked when people talk about his work. Sure, folks dive into his modern writing and deep thoughts, but they usually skip the fact that he was really into things like astrology, Rosicrucian beliefs, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Theosophy, and other mystical traditions from the West. For Pessoa, these weren't just side gigs, they were central to his thinking. He wasn't being sarcastic or using metaphors when he talked about spiritual influences and secret wisdom only available to a select few. He truly believed in this stuff. Understanding Pessoa's mindset requires grasping his affinity for symbolic thinking. Early on, he declared that his mind was geared towards symbols and analogies. While many schooled in scientific thinking might see this as a drawback, symbols being seen as something primitive that science has moved past, Pessoa saw it differently. He argued that symbolic thinking outshines cold, hard logic because symbols bring out connections that straightforward reasoning misses. Symbols unveil ties, similarities, and links that the rational brain, so focused on literal truths and logical consistency, can't see. This idea ties into a core belief from Hermetic philosophy: as above, so below. According to this, the universe runs on connections between different realities. What happens up in the sky affects what goes down on Earth. Understanding life means seeing these links, spotting patterns that connect seemingly unrelated things. Rational thinking tends to put things in neat boxes, while symbolic thinking shows how everything's secretly intertwined. When it came to astrology, Pessoa didn't mess around. He wasn't reading horoscopes for fun, he was dead serious about it. He crunched numbers to get planetary positions just right, and churned out thorough astrological assessments. He made birth charts for himself, his various personas, the ones he called heteronyms, famous folks, and even his home country of Portugal. He went as far as to forecast political stuff, personal luck, and cultural shifts using the stars' positions. To him, astrology was more dependable than the history or sociology in explaining human behaviour. He didn't consider this superstition. It was all part of his belief system. If the mind is a jumble of different pieces, what ties them all together? In Pessoa's view, is those astrological forces. Your birth chart, which maps out the cosmic setup when you were born, influences your personality, outlines the possibilities and sets the boundaries. While it doesn't wipe out free will, it does sketch out the limits within which you can exercise your freedom. Even his different personas each got their own birth chart, since each one needed a unique astrological blueprint to explain their distinct traits. Pessoa was also into Rosicrucianism, a mystical Christian belief that claims to hold ancient secret knowledge. Rosicrucians focus on spiritual evolution, a mystical take on Christianity, and a forthcoming shift to a higher state of consciousness. They dabble in alchemical symbols, intricate geometry, and grand mythological stories. Pessoa soaked all of this up and wove it into his dream of a fifth empire. For him, the fifth empire wasn't just about political realms. It was about a Rosicrucian prophecy, signalling a spiritual transformation as forecasted by esoteric teachings. He got into sacred geometry, big time, convinced that shapes like circles, triangles, and squares had mystical meanings. To Pessoa, these weren't just math problems. They were symbols reflecting divine order. He believed the universe itself was crafted with geometric precision, and understanding these shapes could unlock the secrets of reality. Pessoa's poetry often wraps geometric images not just for decoration, but to offer a philosophical take on insights words can't easily convey. He dove into Kabbalah too, a rich Jewish mystical realm that zooms in on divine structures and hidden messages buried in sacred scriptures. Concepts like the tree of life and multiple dimensions of reality seeped into his thoughts on self-awareness and identity. It's almost like his heteronyms represent different aspects of divine thought embodied in human form. Now, whether his involvement in Freemasonry went beyond just initiation is up for debate, but Masonic themes do pop up in his writings. The whole idea of veiled wisdom, slow revelation, and symbolic rituals seemed to jive with how he saw the world. He also explored Theosophy, which is Helena Blavatsky's blend of Eastern and Western spiritual ideas. Concepts like karma, reincarnation, and spiritual growth weave through his works. But did he truly buy into all this mystical stuff? Scholars can't quite tell if his beliefs were deeply held, or if he was just playing around at an intellectual level. The evidence leans towards a mix. He genuinely invested time in the occult, wrote earnestly, yet embraced an ironic distance too, recognizing that mystical tales are as much mythological as they are literal. This ties back to his broader outlook. If pure reason can't unravel reality's mysteries, maybe other ways of knowing are key. Mysticism can offer insights beyond logic's reach. Symbols tell truths that plain language can't hold, and hidden traditions keep the wisdom that reason overlooks. Pessoa's heteronyms act as gateways, each unlocking a unique perspective on existence. Crafting and embracing these identities became almost a spiritual quest, rather than just a writing trick, but that raises some tough philosophical questions. First, there's verifying the authenticity of mystical insights. How do you differentiate them from mere fantasy? Without a rational yardstick, aren't you at risk of believing anything? Pessoa might argue that the proof is in the living, in engaging with symbols that shed light on life. But this kind of confirmation is personal and doesn't offer a universal measure. Then there's the matter of cherry-picking. He pulled from diverging mystical traditions like Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah, Hermeticism and Theosophy, each claiming different truths. How did he sift through what to adopt? It seems he favoured a blend, merging any useful elements while sidestepping contradictions, which can muddle his mystical view. Believing in overlapping Jewish, Christian and Hindu worldviews simultaneously only works if you see them all as metaphorical. But metaphorical for what? That's something Pessoa left open. Lastly, the practicality issue. Did his mystical practices yield results? His astrological forecasts missed the mark, and his magic didn't visibly change the world. Predictions about Portugal's grand destiny fell flat too. Looked at from a practical lens, his mysticism didn't deliver. His counter might be that the real impact is inward, shifting the psyche rather than changing the physical world. But this unwittingly suggests that occultism veers close to placebo effects or self-deception. Alright, let's take another swing at this. First up, there's that political issue we talked about earlier. When you get into esoteric elitism, it can morph into political elitism pretty quickly. If a select few have some secret knowledge that the rest don't, it follows that those in the know should hold power over everyone else. This paves the way for hierarchy, authoritarian leanings, and a real disdain for democratic fairness. It's like Pessoa's mix of mysticism and politics just egg each other on in a problematic way. It suggests that a spiritual elite ought to lead the clueless masses. Then there's this ongoing debate among scholars. Did Pessoa's mysticism come from a place of genuine spirituality, or was it more of an escape from life's disappointments? Looking at his life, he was often alone and didn't see a whole lot of success or fulfillment. Mystical belief seemed to give him a sense of purpose that reality just didn't. The allure of having hidden wisdom and a special calling could have been a way to compensate for not meeting worldly goals. Sure, this might explain the psychology behind it all, but it doesn't necessarily back up the truth of his mystical claims. People often dive into occult beliefs when real life just doesn't cut it. But that doesn't mean these beliefs are true. Maybe just handy for certain personality types. Another wrinkle is symbolic thinking itself. Symbols inherently leave a lot of wiggle room in meaning. They'll signify different things to different people. Think about geometric shapes, astrological signs, or mythological tales. They can be stretched to fit almost any interpretation. There's no pinned down meaning, no objective truth in symbols. So while symbols aren't much use for solid knowledge, they still have a place in art and the realm of personal exploration. Despite these issues, Pessoa's mysticism fed into his work both philosophically and artistically. Symbolic thinking framed his various heteronyms, each channeling a different symbolic arrangement, a method of experiencing life through myths and archetypal patterns. Shunning literal, rational thought opened the door to wild new ideas. His sense of hidden connections and multiple realities shaped his thoughts on identity and awareness. In his work, mysticism and philosophy are deeply intertwined, both shaking off the notion of scientific materialism and linear rationality. The big question nowadays is figuring out if there's anything worthwhile to salvage from Pessoa's esoteric inclinations. A lot of scholars see it as little more than an interesting lens into who he was, yet not particularly vital in evaluating his ideas. Others argue that stripping away the mysticism means you're missing the very heart of his thought. Maybe his mysticism cooked up some pretty compelling metaphors and structures that stand up artistically, even if they don't literally hit the mark. The whole astrological and hermetic framework fueled his creativity without needing to be spot-on factual. The real value lies in the artistry and thought that bloomed from it, rather than the occult starting points. This leads to a practical stance. Maybe the best way to judge mysticism is by what it brings to the table, rather than searching for literal truth. If symbolic stories spark new insights, why not use them whether or not they absolutely match reality? Like if astrology offers a useful insight into character, go with it, even if there's no planetary influence happening. And if esoteric lore starts to weave meaningful life's tales, adopt them, true or not. Pessoa seemed to take this route, utilizing mystical notions to fuel his philosophical and artistic quests. But there's a price to this method. It basically frames mysticism as a kind of useful fiction rather than a beacon of true knowledge, which is something a true mystic would likely balk at. Stripping away the truth claims dilutes mysticism into mere subjectivity or aesthetic tastes. Some beliefs might need a deeper commitment beyond just being functional. Maybe real mysticism asks for faith, not just a practical tool for inspiration. If that's the case, then Pessoa's approach, kind of a sophisticated yet ironic stance, might end up as something you can't really hold on to fully. Wanting spiritual insight without having spiritual belief, yearning for secret knowledge but not accepting any knowledge as ultimately true, that's a bit of a head-scratcher. It's like being a mystic who isn't quite sure about their own mysticism, or a philosopher unsure about philosophy itself. Part 7. Modernism and Literary Innovation. Fernando Pessoa was a standout in modernism, but his connection to the movement was pretty unique. He was there from the start of Portuguese modernism, even co-launching the journal Orfeo in 1915, which shook up the literary scene in Lisbon. However, he didn't really mingle with the international modernist circles, barely travelled, didn't publish a whole lot, and kept his distance from other writers of the time. His take on modernism was mostly a solo journey, aligning with what's happening in Europe and America more through similar breakthroughs than direct influences. The whole Orfeo uproar is worth mentioning because it highlights how much Pessoa's work pushed boundaries, even among the avant-garde. The journal put out 2 issues full of bold poetry, challenging manifestos, and stuff meant to jolt the middle-class mindset. Critics tore into it, branding the contributors as nuts and degenerates. But that's exactly what Pessoa was going for. Modernism, in his view, was about kicking not just traditional art forms to the curb, but the whole cultural setup behind them. Stirring up the bourgeois wasn't just a stunt. It was about proving that typical tastes were more about conventional bias than real artistic judgment. Yet Pessoa's modernism wasn't quite like other forms out there. Take Italian futurism, which had an impact on his heteronym Álvaro de Campos. It hailed speed, power, machines and war, coming off very macho, politically backward and artistically oversimplified. Pessoa tapped into the vigour but ducked the ideology. Campos might write odes to machines but ends up in a rut, illustrating how technology's supposed freedom can lead to mental turmoil instead. The hyper-futurism gets exposed as a frantic facade hiding an existential void. Meanwhile, French surrealism emerged in the 1920s, digging into the subconscious, automatic writing, and dream worlds. Pessoa played with automatic writing and explored the psyche's fractures. However, while surrealists were after an inner truth beyond societal norms, Pessoa discovered a lack of any singular self, just bits and pieces in constant tussle. Surrealism aimed for freedom through the unconscious. Pessoa flipped it, showing the unconscious as layered and fictive, just like the conscious mind. There was no genuine essence to tap into, only various fictional layers. English and American modernists like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound leaned on impersonality, structural daring, and tradition reimagined radically. In Eliot's The Wasteland, narrative splits, mixes styles and pulls from different languages and cultures to craft a mosaic of cultural wreckage. But Pessoa was on another level. While Eliot maintained one authorial voice navigating different views, Pessoa birthed clearly distinct authors. Eliot might reference tradition. Pessoa became it through heteronyms, crafting in various historical styles. Joyce's narrative experiments in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake echoed Pessoa's heteronymic technique. Both dismantle cohesive narrative consciousness into clashing voices. Both regard identity as shaped by language and expression. Both push modernist edges so far they flirt with unreadability. Despite this, Joyce held on to a biographical thread, an Irish writer embodying many voices. Pessoa pushed further, professing biographical fracturing, one individual with sincerely separate personas. Virginia Woolf's insights into consciousness, especially in The Waves with its 6 distinct voices, mirrored Pessoa's style. But Woolf's figures are characters, fictional beings crafted by an author. Pessoa's heteronyms might seem like just fictional characters, but according to Pessoa, they're much more. They're distinct selves he became, not just ones he invented. This isn't just a clever literary trick, it actually touches on philosophy. If they're mere characters, we're looking at some impressive storytelling skills, but if they're actual alternate identities, then what Pessoa did was a philosophical game changer. When you dive into the technical side, Pessoa brought some cool new ideas to poetry that people still don't fully appreciate. Take intersectionism, for example, a term scholars use to describe his efforts to capture multiple viewpoints all at once in a single poem. Most poems stick with one perspective at a time, but intersectionist poetry tries to mirror how we really experience the world. Layered, not straightforward. This idea only gained traction much later, yet Pessoa was doing it way back in the 1910s. Now let's talk about his poetic voices. They were groundbreaking, showing unique sophistication that hadn't been seen before. Each heteronym had its own distinct way of writing. Caeiro, for example, used the present tense with hardly any subordinate clauses because he focused on direct perception. In contrast, Reis went for long, complex sentences in classical meters, which matched his stoic and formal approach. Campos' style could swing wildly, with his syntax changing based on his mood. Sometimes it was fast and chaotic, other times it was slow and compressed. And Pessoa himself? His writing was introspective and full of self-doubt, often diving deep into philosophical reflection in Portuguese. But it wasn't just about style. Pessoa also experimented with what you could call philosophical lyricism. This meant mixing the intellectual depth you usually find in prose with the emotional sunch of poetry. Most poems either pour out emotions or wrestle with ideas, but Pessoa managed to do both at once. He used vivid images and metaphors to make philosophical points that also packed an emotional wallop, like when he contrasted the beauty of the Tagus River with the simple river in his village, making a philosophical point about how incomparable things are, while also celebrating a specific place. Pessoa's reach extended beyond poetry. His work, especially the Book of Disquiet, broke new ground that later writers would follow. This fictional diary with philosophical musings inspired authors like Clarice Lispector and W.G. Sebald, exploring themes like the blurred lines between autobiography and fiction, the lack of a traditional narrative, and the mix of trivial observations with deep existential thoughts. He also revolutionized the concept of authorship. Before him, pseudonyms were just a way to protect privacy or help women publish without using their real names. Everyone knew who was behind them. But Pessoa's heteronyms were different. They each had their own backstories, personalities, and opinions that even contrasted with Pessoa's own. They interacted with each other, debated, and took different stands in the literary world. This made authorship itself something complex and up for debate. This shakes up how we understand literature. Usually we assume one author means one voice, one perspective, one historical setting. But with Pessoa, that's not the case. He forced us to rethink those assumptions. When diving into Cairo's writing, do you try to interpret it through what we know of Cairo's supposed life and beliefs, by looking at Pessoa's own circumstances, or by considering how they relate to each other? There's no one right answer because the text hangs in a sort of limbo between what's real and what's made up, between the character and the creator, between what's dreamed up and what's uncovered. Thinkers like Roland Barthes talked about this idea, saying the author's influence ends after the text is written, and that it's up to the readers to make sense of it their way. Pessoa got there too, but he came at it from a different angle. Where Barthes wanted to free the text by removing the author, Pessoa just added more authors to the mix, showing there was never just one to deal with anyway. They both landed in the same place, but took different roads to get there. Pessoa's path was more daring since he didn't just talk about it, he lived it. But this approach also uncovered the limits of modernism. If you push his method all the way, how do you even manage to publish? If you're truly divided into many selves, which one makes the publishing call? Who signs contracts, or takes the blame or the credit? Pessoa barely published anything because getting something out there needed him to be a single person, not many. This big idea that should have led to a ton of work ended up in mostly silence and bits and pieces. Same goes for how Pessoa's deep mingling of narrative and thought can make communication tough. Folks find the Book of Disquiet hard to wrap their heads around because there's no easy story to follow. No characters growing along a path, no themes unfolding smoothly. It asks readers to pay attention way more closely and stick with it, which scares off a lot of folks. The creative breakthrough works great as art, but it trips when it comes to reaching an audience. Pessoa chose the internal over what's outside, and if you go down that path too far, you lose what you might write about. If what's happening out there isn't important, if thinking matters more than doing, if dreaming tops living, then what do you write about? Just your own mind mulling over itself. That makes for deep philosophical musings, but a narrow field of topics. You won't find love poems from Pessoa because he didn't experience love, nor political verses because he steered clear of politics, and there aren't traditional nature poems since nature only mattered as a backdrop for thinking. His new approach stripped literature of its usual subjects. Scholars are split on whether Pessoa pushed modernism to its peak or drove it into the ground. Fans see him as someone who took modernist ideas to their logical ends, showing truths others only hinted at. Critics argue he laid bare modernism's weaknesses, with its leanings toward self-obsession, darkness, and being out of touch. Both sides have points. Pessoa showed where unchecked modernist creativity leads. The result is as much a marvel as it is a dead end. The big question for today's writers is what to do with Pessoa's ideas now. You can't just copy his use of different personas because their power was in being one of a kind. You can't fully take on his method because it leads to being cut off and unfinished. But maybe you can take lessons from the ideas without going all the way off the deep end. Accept that identity isn't just one thing without splitting it entirely. Dive into the self while still keeping a foot in the world. Play around with structure without making your work impossible to engage with. This balanced take might hold onto Pessoa's wisdom while dodging his downfalls, but it might also miss what made his work noteworthy in the first place. That fearless chase of truth, even if it walks straight into silence and falling apart. Part 8. Influence, legacy, and modern importance. There's something ironic about Pessoa's influence. During his lifetime, he pretty much stayed out of the limelight, publishing next to nothing, living quietly, and passing away without much notice really, except from a small circle of folks in Lisbon. Yet nowadays people consider him a giant, one of the 20th century's most impactful writers. Movements like existentialism, postmodernism, and theories of plural identity all want to claim him as one of their own. To understand why he became such a big deal much later on, we need to look at how his work gained international attention and why it speaks to today's issues. The key turning point was the discovery of a trunk. After Pessoa passed away in 1935, a friend of his found this big wooden chest, filled with over 25,000 pages of stuff he'd written. Everything from poems, fragments of stories, plays, philosophical essays, to translations and other assorted writings. It took forever to sort through it all, catalogue it, and get it published. The first big collection of his poetry didn't come out until 1942, and the full Portuguese version of the Book of Disquiet wasn't published until 1982. Other major works kept trickling out even into the 1990s and 2000s, so you could say that Pessoa's real literary career kicked off posthumously. This delayed recognition really matters. Unlike other authors who could tweak their image and legacy by deciding exactly what and how to publish while they were alive, Pessoa left behind a total mess. Editors had to decide how to put it all together, what to publish, how to piece the fragments, which versions of poems to go with, and to sort out which heteronym wrote what. Each editor made different decisions, resulting in many conflicting versions of Pessoa's body of work. There's no ultimate version of Pessoa, just various editorial takes based on the original manuscripts. This instability makes him modernism's most genuinely unpredictable writer, with no single fixed text. International fame didn't happen overnight. The first English translation showed up in 1938, 3 years after he died. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that serious translations into English gained traction, and the first full English Book of Disquiet came out in 2002. French, German, Spanish and Italian versions followed a similar pattern. Recognition took a while, but it eventually caught on. People in Portugal caught on earlier to his genius, but he remained mostly a national treasure until the late 20th century. Pessoa's big breakthrough came when literary theory and philosophy shifted, making his work seem ahead of its time. Post-structuralists critiqued the idea of a single, unified self, saying that language shapes identity, rather than just reflects it, and celebrated the complexity of texts. Pessoa fit right into this new way of thinking. Scholars could use his heteronyms to illustrate their philosophical ideas. Think of Barth's notion of the death of the author. It's all there in Pessoa's myriad of authors. Derrida's idea of difference with endless meanings is evident in Pessoa's heteronyms. Foucault's concept of the author function is vividly demonstrated in the way Pessoa acted as multiple authors all at once. Existentialists also claim Pessoa as their own, even after the fact. He tackled themes like authenticity and bad faith, showed that identity is a matter of choice, and that consciousness gives meaning in an otherwise meaningless universe. Sartre's idea that existence comes before essence could have been Pessoa's slogan. And Camus' absurdity is a constant thread in the Book of Disquiet. Though Pessoa passed away before existentialism became a formal movement, his work clearly foreshadowed a lot of its key ideas. In today's world of identity politics, Pessoa unexpectedly remains relevant. His ideas that identity is performed, diverse and constructed, have been embraced by queer theorists, transgender activists, and scholars working on various identity positions. His heteronyms demonstrate how a single person can genuinely occupy multiple identity roles without seeming fake. They show that you can be many things at once without losing yourself. All of this has a hint of politics, though that wasn't Pessoa's intention. Nevertheless, his writings open up a lot of doors. When it comes to psychology and cognitive science, these fields have found something intriguing in Pessoa's work too. Ideas about how the mind is modular, how people have different self-states, and how identity gets pieced together resonate with Pessoa's heteronyms. It's almost like he gave a sneak peek into how consciousness ticks when it's not boxed into one single unit. Some psychologists believe that instead of being a disorder, having multiple identities is just how humans tend to be, pointing to Pessoa as a healthy example of this multiplicity. On the flip side, some think there was an issue there but admit it led to some great work. The conversation on this topic is still ongoing. On the literary front, Pessoa keeps popping up as a source of inspiration. Octavio Paz once called him one of the greatest poets of the century, and Harold Bloom saw him as an essential part of the Western literary collection. Modern poets from all sorts of backgrounds look up to him, especially those interested in juggling different voices, exploring identity, and mixing in some deep thinking with their lyrics. When it comes to prose, Pessoa's Book of Disquiet has touched many writers like W. G. Sebald, Enrique Villa-Matas, and Clarice Lispector, to name a few. What Pessoa did with his fragmented, thoughtful prose has turned into a stone-cold genre in itself. Philosophically, Pessoa's ideas have stirred up lots of discussions about personal identity, consciousness and self-awareness. Philosophers looking into narrative identity often bring up his work to show how storytelling can shape who we are. For those studying consciousness from multiple viewpoints, Pessoa's body of work is like a goldmine. He's also of interest to scholars examining how much we can deviate from a unified consciousness before things fall apart. Essentially, Pessoa has become a go-to for philosophical musings, beyond just being a literary great. In Portugal, Pessoa has reached an almost saint-like status. They featured his face on the currency before the euro took over, built statues, and set up the Casa Fernando Pessoa Museum to remember him. Scholars are always diving into his work, making new additions and studying his everything. Ask any well-versed Portuguese person about him, and they'll know his work inside out. He's seen as a global symbol of Portuguese culture, right up there with beloved national treasures. It's all a bit funny, considering he had some harsh words for Portuguese society and the political mess he lived through. The country he was so critical of now hails him as its prime cultural export. However, this influence seems ripe for some misunderstandings. Lots of people find ways to claim Pessoa aligns with ideas he'd probably push back on. Those appreciating his identity experiments may not mention his more conservative thinking. Next to that, folks into postmodernism might praise the uncertainty in his text but underplay his mystical side, whereas others focus on his mental state while skipping his deeper philosophical stance. In a way, everyone builds a version of Pessoa that suits their needs, mirroring his own multiplicity, but perhaps overshadowing the real person. Nowadays, people wonder whether Pessoa's spotlight reveals true philosophical insight, or is more of a case of the right interpretations at the right time. Did he really unravel lasting truths about identity and consciousness, or is it just his particular era's intrigue coming back into fashion? Are we in the middle of a renaissance uncovering his timeless value, or are we just making it up as we go? Those arguing for his lasting importance point to how Pessoa tackled timeless questions. How does the mind organize so many parts into one? What keeps the self steady even as we change? How do language and thought intertwine? How do imagination and reality cross paths? These aren't questions tied to a specific time. They're evergreen philosophical puzzles. Pessoa might not have solved all these problems, but he gave us a lens that helps in exploring them, tapping into the very essence of the human journey. On the other side, skeptics suggest that our take on Pessoa has shifted with the changing tides of theoretical and cultural leanings. Back in the day when new criticism was all the rage, with its focus on the unified whole of a text in its natural form, he didn't matter much. But when post-structuralism came along, with its spotlight on breaking things apart and the fleeting nature of meaning, he suddenly seemed relevant. His style speaks to the postmodern crowd, yet might come off as outdated if the cultural winds change again. His impact isn't really about the value of his work alone, but more about how it matches up with the thinking trends of the time. Different periods create their own versions of Pessoa, shaped by their unique issues. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some of what Pessoa had to say holds timeless value. The idea that our sense of self isn't as tight-knit as we like to think remains vital. His look into how our minds can break into pieces yet still work fine gives insight into how our cognition is put together. The artistic feat of crafting truly distinct literary voices from one individual showcases our ability for self-reinvention. These accomplishments stand the test of time, no matter what theoretical trend is in fashion. But other parts of his work don't hold up so well. His spiritual musings come off as outdated to modern readers. His political views can make even his fans cringe. His seclusion and unfinished work seem more like issues than philosophical statements. His lack of published work looks less like a bold rejection of selling out, and more like a struggle to finish what he started. The endless scraps of his writing can seem more like a failure to organise his thoughts, rather than being seen as a new kind of form. Today's readers might take lessons from Pessoa, but they shouldn't try to copy him. He was a one-of-a-kind example of possibility, not a roadmap for others to follow. Perhaps the biggest thing Pessoa left us with is the idea that writing and philosophy can be one and the same. He dissolved the lines between different types of writing, turning his life and creative output into a continuous exploration of the mind. He showed that some of the deepest philosophical thoughts might arise through poetry, through imagined voices instead of rigid arguments, through the act of writing rather than structured reasoning. This offers new ways for philosophy to be practiced, questions to be pondered and truths to be expressed. Whether or not this leads to anything fruitful is still up in the air. But with Pessoa, he showed that such a door exists, and that is more than enough of a contribution. Part 9. Main debates in Pessoa research. Studying Pessoa is quite tricky because his work is huge yet incomplete. Picture this. There are 25,000 pages full of bits and pieces, different versions, mixed up ideas, and stuff he just dropped halfway through. So the big question for experts is always about what Pessoa truly believed versus what was just him playing around. What's real philosophy versus literary experimenting? What's him being serious versus just being ironic? These questions keep sparking arguments that might never really end. The first big topic people argue about is what these heteronyms of his really mean. Some folks think they're just clever literary tools, characters he dreamed up to try out various philosophical ideas. This camp sees Pessoa as a mastermind, juggling many voices for the sake of art and intellect. They point to his writings where he talks about how these characters relate to each other, their backstories and how he planned their interactions as proof he was fully in control. But others say these heteronyms show that Pessoa had genuine multiple personalities, something like different mental states popping up on their own with a mind of their own. There's this famous story where he said one character, Caeiro, suddenly appeared and boom. 30 poems came out just like that, unplanned. Pessoa himself said this was all involuntary, and he never knew what these heteronyms would do until they did it. Why does this matter? Well, it's philosophical. If the heteronyms are just made up, Pessoa's work is still awesome, but it doesn't show that identity is truly multi-layered. But if they're real alternate personalities, it adds weight to the idea that maybe the self is just a story we tell ourselves and that we naturally have many sides. Most experts now think it's a bit of both. The heteronyms popped up on their own at first, but were then shaped purposefully. Still, this doesn't fully satisfy anyone on either side. The second big debate is about whether Pessoa's ideas were ahead of his time, fitting into postmodernism, or were they still rooted in older philosophies? Those leaning towards postmodernism focus on his questioning of a unified self and playing around with unstable texts, his rejection of absolute truths, and how he offered many perspectives without a single overarching story to tie them together. These folks say he paved the way for thinkers like Derrida and Baudrillard, tapping into postmodernism before it was cool. However, critics think this view is a stretch. They argue that Pessoa was working within a very different framework from what we consider postmodern. His beliefs in mysticism seem to support hidden truths, quite unlike postmodern relativism. His nationalism seemed to champion a unified cultural identity, which opposes postmodern beliefs against fixed identities. Plus, his ideas about authenticity, even if paradoxical, don't quite match postmodern disregard for an authenticity. This supposed postmodern vibe might come from cherry-picking his ideas and skipping the ones that don't fit. Some scholars say he had glimpses of postmodern thoughts, but was still tangled up in modern ideas, sparking more debates about what parts of his work fall into which category. The third debate centres on Pessoa's political views and how they connect to his philosophy. Those on the left highlight contradictions in his political stances. So some folks point out that Pessoa, even though he initially kind of vibed with dictatorships, eventually spoke out against Salazar's regime. They highlight how his push for individualist anarchism seems at odds with his love for nationalism. But here's the kicker. During his life, his political influence wasn't all that big. They say that his belief system, which embraces multiple identities, clashes with his old-school political views, making for a mash of ideas that don't really gel. On one hand, Pessoa's philosophical side was quite forward-thinking. On the other, his political side seems stuck in the past. Some scholars who lean towards conservative and nationalist views believe that Pessoa's political stance is a natural extension of his philosophical ideas. They argue that for there to be a bunch of different selves, you need to stack them in some kind of order, otherwise you get chaos. If truth isn't one size fits all, then coming to a consensus in a democracy becomes tricky. Highlighting great individuals could also justify elitist politics, and his mysticism leans on spiritual over secular knowledge. For these scholars, Pessoa's political ideas don't clash with his philosophy, but rather they unfold from it. They believe if you buy into his philosophical ideas, his politics are just part of the package. However, there are thinkers who would rather tease apart his political ideas from his philosophical ones, considering the latter a valuable contribution while seeing his political views as personal missteps. Yet doing so suggests that someone can be sharp as a tack on subjects like identity, but completely off the mark when it comes to the bigger picture of society. While not impossible, it does raise eyebrows. Maybe the tough pill to swallow is that Pessoa's philosophical ideas might just lend a hand to reactionary politics, or at the very least don't stop them in their tracks. Having all these perspectives without a North Star to guide the choice can easily spiral into just doing things for power's sake. Then you've got the excitement around Pessoa's dive into mysticism and esoteric stuff. Rationalist types often brush this off as just quirky details about his life, claiming it doesn't really weigh in on his literary genius. They're of the mind that you can enjoy the poetry and prose without buying into astrology or secret societies. To them, mysticism is just an add-on, something culturally tied to Pessoa's era more than a core component of his brilliance. But there's another camp arguing against this take, folks who think mysticism is the very bedrock of Pessoa's work. They say you can't really make sense of his alter egos, or heteronyms, without that mystical lens, where different layers of reality overlap and hidden truth surface through symbolic connections. Take out the esoteric stuff and you'll flatten him into just another modernist. His appeal, they argue, is in blending new literary styles with mystical elements, mingling clear-minded philosophy with gut-feeling intuition. Lately, there's been a push to seriously reconsider his mystical side, asking whether scholars should dive in and try to see the world through his unique lens or write it off as irrational. Can you really get what Pessoa was all about without at least dipping a toe into his beliefs? Or does true understanding demand stepping into a mindset far removed from today's logical, secular standards? Lastly, there's a debate buzzing about what's going on with Pessoa psychologically. Some scholars suggest that his creation of various identities might signal some dissociative stuff going on, rather than just being a showcase of philosophical depth or a nifty literary trick. They point to his isolation, trouble sticking with relationships, decision-making woes, and his all-consuming throws into work as signs of something not quite right upstairs. They caution against putting Pessoa on a pedestal if it means glamorizing mental turmoil, but others push back on psychoanalyzing long-gone figures, calling it too simplistic. They remind us that Pessoa managed to keep a steady gig, made friends along the way, and turned out a mountain of written work. For them, just because something isn't the norm doesn't mean it's unhealthy. Pessoa delved into realms of consciousness that most folks tend to steer clear of. It's not about having psychological issues, but rather a matter of philosophical bravery. Labelling these rare cases as mental problems sets a standard of normalcy and dismisses unique ideas as mere disorders. Now, we're never going to settle this debate because we don't really have the proof to peek into Pessoa's mind, and modern ways of diagnosing don't quite fit historical figures. Yet it does spark important questions on how genius and madness might mingle, or how creativity can intertwine with dysfunction, and the fine line between profound philosophical insight and psychological upheaval. Maybe Pessoa was both a genius and a bit troubled, his brilliance tied up with whatever was going on inside his head. Another discussion revolves around whether an author aims to convey specific meanings in it if readers can catch them. But with Pessoa creating so many author personas, pinning down a single meaning becomes a tricky task. Take for instance when Caeiro, one of his heteronyms, wrote, "To think is not to understand." Is that Pessoa's thought? Caeiro's personal stance? An idea exploring something against or critiquing what he believed? There's no clear answer. So the text hangs in a kind of interpretive uncertainty because there's no single author's intention guiding us. Some scholars think this frees readers to make their meanings, while others find it a nightmare for analysis, arguing it turns criticism into mere personal opinions. This ties into broader arguments in literary theory about where meaning really lives, whether it's with the texts, the authors, the readers, or the communities interpreting them. Then there's the topic of where Pessoa fits in with philosophers. Is he a philosopher using the tools of a writer, or a writer with a splash of philosophical thought? Philosophers largely pass over him, seeing his work as purely literary. Meanwhile, literary experts dive deep into his work, but tend to overlook the philosophical angles, treating them as just poetic themes. So Pessoa ends up in this in-between space, claimed by neither camp. Some argue he was indeed a true philosopher, albeit with a literary spin on his methods and insights. Others maintain philosophy and literature are distinct, stating that his lack of a systematic argument disqualifies him, no matter how deep his thoughts. It's a reflection of ongoing debates about whether philosophy has to be structured, if literary work can be truly philosophical, or if poetic and philosophical truths are fundamentally different. Another angle is how to translate and interpret Pessoa, given that he primarily wrote in Portuguese, but he also worked in English and even a bit in French. His Portuguese writings have a playfulness and intricacy that's hard to capture in another language. Different translators bring out different sides of him in English, meaning whoever reads him in translation gets a different experience than someone reading the original Portuguese. This points to questions about how much his international reputation leans on the quality and choices of translation, and whether people who don't speak Portuguese can truly grasp Pessoa. This overlaps with arguments about the importance of historical and cultural context, since Pessoa's work is tied deeply to early 20th century Portuguese life. When international readers dive into his works, they often miss this context, interpreting him as if he spoke to universal themes rather than specific ones. Portuguese scholars sometimes claim his reception worldwide makes him seem more postmodern and broad than he was, losing the particularities of being profoundly Portuguese. These scholarly debates about Pessoa are likely to go on and on because his work refuses to be pinned down to a single interpretation. He intentionally crafted his work with a variety of viewpoints, often leaving them unfinished and allowing editors to publish them only after his death, mixing elements that didn't seem to belong together. This led to a constant state of interpretive uncertainty. No reading tells the whole story, and any analysis can be disputed. This approach aligns perfectly with his belief in diversity and his dismissal of singularity. You can't pin down one definitive interpretation of Pessoa's work, because he himself was a complex and multifaceted individual. The discussions and debates are exactly how one should engage with the writings of someone who truly embraced the idea of multiplicity. Part 10. So let's dive into where Pessoa's take on life hits the brakes and shows its weak spots. It's important to see where his way of thinking turns from genius insights to things that just don't work. It's like looking at a puzzle where some pieces fit and some don't. First off, his ideas sound neat in theory, but living them? That's a whole different ballgame. The idea of splitting identities, ditching the concept of a single you, and valuing imagination over what's real might seem deep, but when you try to live it, it gets messy. Look at Pessoa himself for proof. Hardly published, no close relationships, and lived a short life with cirrhosis. These aren't just random fails. They're kind of what you get if you live by his ideas. Take the decision issue. If you're made up of many parts, picking a direction in life becomes a nightmare. Making choices means you hope the version of you doing the picking sticks around long enough to see what happens. But if the you who decides is likely not the you who sees the outcome, why should you care? Pessoa got this and wrote about it, but never figured it out. His fix? Not to make any big calls, kind of just float along and leave projects unfinished. That's not clever wisdom. It's more like throwing in the towel. Then there's the isolation bit. If the mind is top dog over reality, what's the point of dealing with others? People are mostly figments of your mind, right? So Pessoa basically lived this way, keeping to himself, and his relationships seem more like case studies than real connections. In his writing, like in the Book of Disquiet, even though the character works among others, he barely notices them. Those few he mentions are more like mannequins than people with their own thoughts. In the end, that's solipsism, the idea that only your mind is definitely real. Take it too seriously, and you can't have ethics because other people are just hypotheticals, not real folks with rights. Another snag is finishing things. If imagining success feels more real than actually getting there, where's the push to cross the finish line? Why bother completing a work when the version in your head is perfect? This led to Pessoa leaving stacks of unfinished pieces behind. His approach basically kills productivity. It can't even support laying out its own ideas fully. So if your philosophy can't hold itself together, it kind of falls apart. Then there's the hurdle of communication. Talking in shared language needs us to settle on meanings together. But if who you are shifts and your thoughts scatter, then talking is more hit or miss than meaningful exchange. You might get words on a page, but whether they land as you meant, that's anyone's guess. Pessoa's writing is loaded with this, beautifully done but open-ended, shaped by what anyone sees in it. Some say that's lush, but really it's poor. Because if you can't make your point clear, it's like speaking a private language that others can't catch on to. Finally, this trickles down to responsibility. Our legal systems expect accountability. If you do wrong, the same you gets the consequences. But Pessoa's scattered self-concept messes with this too. If who we are changes at every moment, then the whole idea of responsibility doesn't make sense anymore. Imagine doing something and then, by the time the consequences roll around, you're not even the same person to deal with them. That's not just some out there theory. Pessoa, for example, dodged commitments and let people down because he honestly felt like the future him was a totally different guy who'd have to handle whatever mess he left behind. If you wipe out responsibility, you pretty much do away with ethics too. And then there's this problem with values. If everything boils down to how we see it, and what it means to us personally, how do we judge anything as good or bad, true or false, pretty or ugly? Pessoa's way of thinking doesn't give us any guidelines for making these calls, since it sees all viewpoints as equally valid, because they're all just different perspectives. That's a recipe for chaos. Saying all perspectives are valid also needs a reason to back it up, but if every standard is tied to a perspective, we're already stuck. The idea essentially disproves itself. Things get murky when it comes to verifying beliefs too. Without a way to test or prove things logically or scientifically, how do we separate true insights from delusions? Most of Pessoa's astrological forecasts didn't pan out, and his visions of Portugal's future glory were way off. Still, he clung to them because esoteric knowledge, he believed, didn't need to be proven in the usual ways. But without testable proof, almost anything goes, and that's not a sign of wisdom. It's just wishful thinking wrapped in the clever words. When examining the political side, Pessoa's ideas lean dangerously toward authoritarianism or nihilism. If there's no objective truth, then the strongest prevails. Without a stable identity, no one stands accountable. If some people are seen as spiritually superior, then democracy gets tossed aside. And if a nation's course is mystically set, who cares about evidence? Pessoa's own political views reflected these ideas. They included support for dictatorship, disdain for democracy, and a belief in a spiritual elite and nationalist ideals. This isn't a random misstep, it's the logical outcome of his philosophical stance. On a mental health note, Pessoa's philosophy seems to echo symptoms of dissociative disorders, struggling to merge experiences into a cohesive self, living in fantasy, fragmenting identity, and ending up isolated sound more like symptoms needing help than philosophical breakthroughs. While his intelligence is undeniable, we shouldn't conflate it with mental health or wisdom. Then there's the academic angle. Despite Pessoa's philosophical ambitions, professional philosophers have largely overlooked him. He's not part of standard philosophy curricula, isn't mentioned in philosophical histories, and you won't find him in the key reference texts. Philosophers don't see him as one of their own, because he didn't adhere to the rules of the discipline. There's no systematized argument, no logical depth, no engagement with existing philosophical literature, nor distinct stances to dissect. He was a literary figure more than a philosophical one. This speaks volumes. Finally, the whole predictive business fell flat too. Pessoa had these grand ideas about Portugal leading a global spiritual revolution, and how the Portuguese language would take over, predicting societal shifts based on astrology. None of this came true. After his days, Portugal's influence faded, its colonies were lost, and the spiritual empire he foresaw never materialized. Despite all this, Pessoa bet his philosophical validity on these very predictions. When predictions don't pan out, it often hints that the underlying philosophy might be flawed. This idea falls apart based on insights from cognitive science. Modern studies on consciousness, identity, and memory don't line up with what Pessoa believed. Our sense of self is held together over time by continuous brain activity. Memory stitching ties our life story together. In contrast, multiple personality disorder is seen as a problem exactly because this normal integration fails. Our brains manage to create a unified sense of self by having different parts work together in harmony. Pessoa's philosophy really seems to deal with the unusual more than the everyday thought process. Making broad claims about identity based on his experience could be seen as overreaching. On the scholarship front, there's a noticeable lack of agreement. If Pessoa's philosophy was straightforward and true, you'd expect scholars to agree on a standard interpretation. Instead, there's a lot of disagreement. They're all over the place on what he believed, whether he was serious or not, how to interpret his writings, and which bits are crucial versus which are not. This isn't the kind of debate that moves understanding forward. It's really a messy chaos that suggests his text might not have a definite meaning. Good philosophy should be clear enough for others to get it and critique it, but Pessoa's intentional murkiness and his many viewpoints make that tough. Then there's the existential aspect, which really hits hard. Pessoa's real life was a struggle. He didn't get much recognition while alive, didn't form long-lasting relationships, didn't produce major finished works, and he passed away pretty much in obscurity. His reported last words hinted at uncertainty about the future. This doesn't sound like someone who found the truth and lived it. It sounds like his philosophy made his life hard to live. A philosophy should ideally help you live well and happily, but at best, Pessoa's might have led to productive pain rather than thriving. Philosophers from the past generally thought that good philosophy should make you happy, wise and virtuous, but with Pessoa, it seemed to make him feel isolated, stuck, and dependent on alcohol. However, labelling Pessoa's philosophy as a total failure isn't entirely fair. Failure can sometimes teach us things. He pushed philosophical ideas right to their limits and found out they don't always work. This is valuable because it teaches us what paths to avoid. His life shows that being completely skeptical about yourself, wholly retreating into fantasy, and rejecting unity altogether leads to nowhere good. There's wisdom in his extremes, even if they serve as warnings instead of guidance. The real challenge now is to see if we can take his insights without falling into the same traps. Can we accept that our identity is somewhat crafted without falling apart? Can we see the mind's complexity while still appreciating its unity? Value imagination while staying grounded? Embrace many perspectives but still commit to some? Maybe Pessoa's missteps show that his insights aren't wrong. They're just risky and I need careful management. Some truths can be mentally harmful, a spiritual burden, or even cause practical problems despite being accurate. Maybe our sense of self is made up, but we need that fiction to get by. Perhaps our identities are multiple, but we have to act like they're unified to keep on living. Consciousness might be scattered, but we need coherence to function. This paints a tragic picture of Pessoa. He found truths that ended up being his downfall. He might have been correct about the nature of things, but was mistaken in confronting it so directly. It's like gazing into the sun. Too much self-awareness can be blinding and destructive. Ironically, Pessoa's own life story kind of shows his philosophy doesn't hold up. If it led to a catastrophic personal life, then maybe it's missing key elements. Those missing things might be the very essentials that make life worth living. Like the helpful myths of a unified self, steady identity, acknowledging the world around us, the ability to take action, and finding meaning in choices. Pessoa broke down these illusions with his mind, only to find out that you can't really live without them in practice. What he left behind isn't something you'd follow like a straight-up philosophy, but rather a line you have to acknowledge. Go up to this point but no further. Understand this much but don't go beyond. Question who you are, but don't forget to keep some consistency. Appreciate having many aspects, but hold on to a sense of oneness. Value dreams and creative thinking, but stay grounded in what's real. Pessoa shows us the edge where clarity meets chaos, where daring to think deeply turns into losing oneself. His work highlights exactly where that line sits, because he stepped over it entirely. We should take his journey as a lesson, but not walk the same path. What he offers is a cautionary tale more than a roadmap.